bowl of gefilte fish. Has anybody ever seen gefilte fish before? Well, it's not very exciting. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
It is once again a pleasure to be back in front of you, the great future barristers and magistrates, Supreme Court justices. It's great to see you again. I hope you're all doing well this morning. As I mentioned earlier, my name is Elvin Dowling. I had the opportunity to speak to you yesterday, and so this is my second bite at the apple. And I've been around long enough now to know that second opportunities oftentimes don't get a third, and so you got to make sure that you don't mess up the first or the second time. It kind of reminds me, Brother Green, of a joke I heard once about a couple that had been married about 60 years or so, and they were asked. They asked the husband, "How have you been able to stay married and committed for all these years?" And the husband went way back to their honeymoon. He said, "You know, when we were on our honeymoon, I took my wife out horseback riding. And as we were out horseback riding, we were galloping along, and the horse tripped and fell, and my wife fell down, and she got up on the horse, and she said, 'Well, that's once.' And they went riding off again, and sure enough, about 20 minutes later, the horse stumbled and fell again. And, you know, the wife got up off the ground, and she looked at the horse, and she said, 'That's twice.' And they're riding along again, and the horse trips a third time. The woman falls, and she gets up, and she takes out a pistol. Pow! Shoots the horse in the head, and the husband says, 'Oh, my God, what are you doing? What's going on? Are you crazy?' She said, 'That's once.'" So I have learned that oftentimes second and third chances don't come. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. So we're going to be talking today about nonprofit corporate governance. Is it necessary or in the way? And as we think about this concept of corporate governance, I think it's important for you all to understand that you are a corporation. And so we ask the question, why do boards matter? The National Black Law Students Association, you have your own board, you have your own corporation, you are your governing body. And so the question becomes, why do boards matter? Now, nonprofits are legally required to have boards of directors. And I think it's important for you to understand that although many of you are probably going to go on and be great civil litigators and possibly prosecutors and federal judges, some of you will spend a lot of time working with nonprofit organizations. And so what I would say to you is that you may find yourself being a member of a nonprofit board. You may find yourself being the general counsel for a nonprofit. And so it's important that you understand the fundamentals and dynamics of board governance. Now, as we said, they are required to have boards of directors. Boards are the holders of the fiduciary responsibility of the organization. That means the buck stops with you. I mentioned yesterday that I had the opportunity to serve as chief of staff for the National Urban League right here in New York City on Wall Street. And I worked for a gentleman by the name of Mark Morial, who's a good alpha man. You know, you can always tell an alpha, you just can't tell him much. And Mr. Morial often kept on his desk a sign that said, "The buck stops here." And so I want you to remember and never forget that when it comes to boards of directors, you're the fiduciary responsibility. The buck stops with you. If the fit hits the shan, proverbially speaking, then it's going to be up you, responsible for you to clean up the mess. And so I want you to keep that in mind. And I also want you to remember that boards are required to ensure the delivery of the mission. Now, I've asked before, what is the mission of this organization? I'm going to ask someone. I asked Mr. Green, can you tell us what the mission of BALSA is?
It is the mission of NBALSA to increase the number of culturally responsible Black and minority attorneys who excel academically, succeed professionally, and positively impact the communities.
Come on here.
Outstanding. So NBALSA's role is to make sure that you're doing the right thing at all times. And so as a member of the board, you're required to ensure the delivery of your mission. Now, yesterday we talked about strategic planning, right? And we talked about the importance of making sure that if it's not in the plan, you don't do it. I have one of my favorite sermons is by Bishop T.D. Jakes, and he preached a sermon about stick to the plan. While in the process, stick to the plan. And so your job is to make sure you stick to the plan. And that plan is the mission of the organization. Now, the board is also responsible to fulfill the tax-exempt status of the organization. So as a nonprofit corporation, typically you don't pay taxes. You fill out a 501c3 application, you submit it to the Internal Revenue Service, and you're not responsible, you don't have to pay federal taxes, but you are responsible for making sure as members of the board that your tax-exempt status never comes into question. And it can come into question if you make dumb, stupid, boneheaded decisions, right? Mm-hmm. And so our job is to make sure that you don't do like we said Scooby-Doo yesterday. So we want to make sure that you know what's going on and that you don't make poor decisions as members of your board. Now, people often question whether boards matter because their day-to-day impact is difficult to observe. But when things go wrong, they can become the center of attention. Well, what does that mean? It's very clear. You are responsible for making sure that everything goes right. And when things go wrong, you're going to get the blame. And so you want to make sure as members of your nonprofit entity, as members of your board, that you are up to date with what's going on, that you understand the dynamics of the organization, and that you don't mess things up. Now, extensive research and practice in nonprofit governance is based on the premise that well-performing boards coincide with well-performing organizations. What does that mean, Brother Dowling? That's real simple. If your board is jacked up, chances are your organization is going to be jacked up too. And so as a board, you have a responsibility to get it right. I can't stress enough the importance of making sure that you understand the dynamics of a board. You may be elected on the board as the treasurer. You may be elected as the secretary. Whatever your role is, obviously you should fulfill your responsibility, but your role is bigger than that. If you're a member of a board of trustees, a board of directors of a nonprofit, guess who gets a vote on everything that comes before that board? You do. So if you're the treasurer of the board, that doesn't mean that you're only dealing with finances. You're going to deal with human resources. You're going to deal with staffing issues. You're going to deal with programming. You're going to deal with everything that comes before that board. So don't get it twisted. Don't let nobody give you the okie doke and say, well, you're just a secretary. So all you have to do is sit in here and take minutes. No. You're responsible for everything that comes before that board. Well, you're just a treasurer. All you have to do is count coins and deposit dollars. No. As a member of the board, you're responsible for every single action, everything that comes before that board. So you want to make sure that it's right. And if you're not doing your jobs properly, everything is jacked up. And so we want to make sure that you have the resources, the skills, the tools, and the insight you need to do your job effectively. Now, ideally, the board guides long-term organization strategy, puts key staff in place to implement it, and monitors performance against the strategy set out. Consequently, bad organization performance and governance begins with the board not fulfilling its key responsibilities. Let's take this apart for a minute. Ideally, the board guides long-term organization and strategy. So yesterday we talked about strategy, right? Anybody remember that? Yes. Bueller, anyone? So we talked about strategy and how important strategy is. Now, you all are future attorneys. You're about to graduate law school and hit the world and serve us with honor and distinction. But you have to have a strategy. When you get into the courtroom, you have to have a strategy on how you're going to address the witnesses. How are you going to voir dire your jury? How are you going to ask those fundamental questions to get to the right answer? One of the things, I am among many things, I'm a certified life and business coach. And one of the things that we learned in coaching school is that if you want to get the right answers, you have to ask the right questions. But asking the right questions begins with and ends with having a good strategy. And so you want to make sure that you have a good strategy from the beginning. The board is also responsible for putting key staff in place to implement it. Now, the challenge that organizations like yourselves, who are student-driven, who may not necessarily have a national office with a full-time executive director or CEO responsible for the day-to-day operation of the organization, you're the staff. You're the chief cook, you're the bottle washer, you're the president, You're everything that comes with that. And so you have to understand that the board is responsible for making sure that you are prepared, making sure that you understand what's going on, making sure that you have the resources and tools to do your job. And then the board monitors performance against the strategy set out. So what was our strategy? Okay, let's go back to the legal perspective. Our strategy is to get this defendant on the stand, and the strategy is to rattle him enough to say the wrong thing. Did you order the code red, Colonel Jessup? Well, you know, this, that. Did you order the code red? Well, you know, did you? You goddamn right I did. That's what you want. That was the strategy to begin with, you know, to draw it out of them. And so we want to make sure that you have a strategy when it comes to your board performance. Now, consequently, board organization performance and governance begins with the board fulfilling its key mission and responsibilities. You are here for a reason. You're elected or selected or appointed to this organization and its board for a reason. Do your job. It's just that simple. You have to fulfill your mission. You have to fulfill your responsibility. And if you can't, that's okay. But we need someone who can. And so if you don't have, for example, the capacity to do the job, if you haven't received the training and no one has offered you the training you need to do the job, or you just decide, I don't want to do that anymore, that's okay. But we need you to step aside so that the individuals that have the time, the energy, and the commitment to do the job so that they could do that work effectively. Now, when we talk about this whole concept of nonprofit governance and strategy, what is the underlying assumption? The underlying assumption is that the best management practices adopted by the best managers cannot succeed in an environment characterized by poor governance. Now, I'm going to ask the question, can anyone tell me, and we'll define governance in a moment, but can anyone tell me from your own perspective what governance is? I don't want to be the law school professor. I don't want to be the law school professor, but I will call on Mr. President. Can you tell us, from your perspective, what governance is?
Governance is at least from my perspective, it's the overall long-term and broad responsibility for the operation, the strategy, and the overall well-being of an organization, whether it's a nonprofit or a country.
Absolutely. How are you governing? And are you governing effectively? So the best management practices adopted by the best managers, the best laid plans of mice and men often go astray. And so I say that to say this. You can have a plan, but you got to make sure that the plan is followed up and down the line. One of my favorite boxers, Mike Tyson, often said that everybody's got a plan until they get punched in the face. And so the question is, what are you going to do when you get punched in the face? And how does that translate in terms of governance and poor governance and how it impacts your organization? And so we want to make sure that you as board members have a plan for getting punched in the face. If you sit on a nonprofit board, if you sit on any kind of board, at some point you will get punched in the face. It may be a lawsuit against your organization. It may be any number of things that could come up, but you will get punched in the face. And so the question is, what is your strategy for dealing with that? And that strategy really starts with training and development, which is what we're doing right now. So let's look at this for a minute. I asked the question, what is governance? Now, the meaning of governance is this. The word comes from the Latin and means to steer or guide. Its use in an organizational context goes all the way back to the 16th and 17th century. Now, governance is a process by which a board of directors, through its management, you're the management, congratulations, through its management, guides an institution in fulfilling its corporate mission and protects the institution's assets over time. So, your job as members of the board is to make sure, first and most importantly, that the doors stay open. Second thing is to make sure that whatever's on the inside of the house is protected. Your job is to safeguard and protect. And it's not just the officer's job. It's not just the chairman's job to safeguard and protect. It's not just the executive director's job or the treasurer's job. It's the job of every single member of the board of directors to safeguard and protect the organization. Don't get it twisted. Don't let somebody tell you, well, your job is to do that and my job is to do something else. No, as members of a board of directors, your job is to make sure that all aspects of the organization are protected. Does that make any sense to anybody? Am I going too fast? Does anybody live on my street?
Wow.
Outstanding. So, we see that the role and the definition is to steer and guide. Now, corporate governance is the system by which corporations are directed and controlled. The corporate governance structure specifies the distribution of rights and responsibilities among different participants in the corporation, such as the board, managers, shareholders, and other stakeholders, and spells out the rules and procedures for making decisions on corporate affairs. Let's pause right there for a moment. Spells out the rules and procedures for making decisions. There's a reason why you have policies and procedures. If you don't have some, you need to get some. One of my favorite movies, and I can't think of the name of it right now, but he asked the question, do you have a license? You don't have a license, then go get you some license. You need some policies and procedures. You need something that is in writing that codifies how you're going to govern the organization. If your organization doesn't have a policy and procedure manual, I would highly suggest that you get one. You should have policies on everything from how you bring on new board members, to how you train them, to how the members of the board of directors operate. You need policies and procedures. I'll give you an example. I mentioned yesterday that I had the opportunity to write a $1 million grant proposal for two different organizations, both of which were funded. And during that process, I had to essentially develop policies and procedures from scratch. And in this particular instance, it was policies and procedures that were directly relevant to mentoring and dealing with children. Now, you know, that can be very tricky. And so we had to make sure that there were policies for everything. How do you deal with the child? How do you talk to the child? Can you give the child a ride home? You know, what are all of these issues? If there are any overnight trips in terms of training with the kids, how do you deal with that? What is the policy in terms of picking up the kids? Do you have to have insurance? I mean, all of those things ought to be covered in your policies and procedures. And so that's where you begin. Now, by doing this, it also provides a structure through which the company's objectives are set and the means of obtaining those objectives and monitoring performance. We talked yesterday about the importance of developing a strategic plan. What are your objectives? Does Inbalsa have objectives for how it's going to govern itself? I don't know the answer to that question, but I would ask you, what are your objectives? What's the point of being here? I remember back in, I believe it was 1992, and Bill Clinton was running for president. There were three people in the race. There was George H.W. Bush, the sitting president. There was the governor of Arkansas, Bill Clinton. And then there was a Texas billionaire by the name of H. Ross Perot. And they all selected their running mates. George Bush selected Dan Quayle, who many would say was one of the smartest vice presidents we had, and most would say was probably not. And Bill Clinton selected Al Gore, and H. Ross Perot selected a gentleman by the name of Admiral Stockdale. And Admiral Stockdale, at the beginning of the debate, during his opening statement, he stood up to the podium and he said, "Who am I? Why am I here?" And everybody was kind of shocked, like, well, who the hell are you and why are you here? But the better question is, what are you trying to do? What are your goals and objectives? Who are you? Why are you doing what you're doing? You ought to have an answer for that question. People, you ought to be able to tell folks, if anyone came up to you, if a Martian dropped out of the sky, you ought to be able to tell them what the objectives of the organization are. And then you ought to have, as a member of the board, a plan for monitoring and gauging that performance. Why is monitoring important? Anybody have any idea of why monitoring your performance as an organization is important to the board? Anyone? Anyone? Yes, ma'am.
That's the only way you're going to know if you're going to meet your goals and objectives, by having the data to say that this is what we're doing, this is how we're doing it, and you can also make course corrections with that information as well.
Absolutely. Course corrections, that's so important. So monitoring allows you to make sure that you're doing what you said you were going to do. when I was Chief of Staff for the National Urban League, I had the opportunity to develop with the league a 4-year strategic plan. And as a part of the strategic plan, we also developed what we called the scorecard. And the scorecard helped us to monitor what we were doing. So we had our objectives. This is a part of the plan. We want to achieve these 5, 6, 7 things, however many there were. And then the scorecard helped us to look at those 7 things, and we were able to determine we are either on track to achieve that objective, we're slightly delayed in achieving that objective, or we're not going to achieve that objective. We need to make sure that we retool, do a course correction, and come up with some other ideas. And so that's the whole point of monitoring. You have to have measurable metrics. Everybody say after me, measurable metrics.
Measurable metrics.
That means those are things that you can measure. How many kids did you serve? How many students did you graduate? How many scholarships did you give out? What are your metrics, and can we measure them? Can we look at that and say, okay, our goal is to have 7 scholarships we give out across the regions of our organization. And then that allows you to say, okay, we have the goal. Now let's measure it. In Region 1, we gave out 2. In Region 3, we gave out 0. How did we measure up? And so it's important to make sure that you have measurable objectives with everything you do as a board. Now, what are the responsibilities of the board of directors? Before I delineate those responsibilities, can someone share with me their thoughts on what the responsibilities of a board of directors is? I love your hand. You're a beautiful woman. And I'd love to call on you all day, but I'm going to call over this beautiful young lady over here. She's looking so nice today. How you doing, sweetheart?
Me?
Yes, ma'am.
I'm well, thank you. How are you?
If I were any better, I'd be twins. Thank you for asking. Would you tell us, in your estimation, what would be a role of a board of directors?
Okay, so to set the tone.
Absolutely. Set the tone, set the vision. Has anybody ever heard the saying, where there is no vision, people perish?
Yes, I've heard it.
Amen, somebody. Some of y'all grew up in church. And so the goal of the board of directors is to set the vision, to set the tone, write the vision and make it plain. And so we're going to talk about that vision and some of the roles of the members of the board of directors. First and most importantly, the board has a duty of care, paying attention and due diligence. One of the biggest challenges with nonprofit members is their board members don't follow a duty of care. They don't pay attention. They don't go to meetings. They don't read the minutes. The minutes aren't given out by the organization in a timely fashion. Your job as members of a board of directors is to make sure that you have all the information you need. You get it in a timely fashion. If they're not handing out your minutes, you need to insist upon that. As officers of an organization, as members of a board, we need the minutes. We need to find out what's going on. I need the treasurer's report. I need the financial statement. We need to go through these things. So you have a duty of care. Just as attorneys, you're going to have a duty of care to your clients to make sure that you pay attention to what's going on with their case, to not make sure that their cases are lost in the shuffle. So board members have a duty of care when it comes to the board of directors. Now, they also have a duty of loyalty. Put the organization first. No conflict of interest. No private gain. You have a duty of loyalty to make sure that the organization comes first. It ain't about you. This ain't your party. This is not about you. It's about summum bonum, the good of the whole. There was an Egyptian phrase many years ago in Egypt, several thousand years ago. In a lot of the temples, they would put the words summum bonum over the doorposts, and that means for the good of the whole. And so the question becomes, what are you doing for the good of the whole? Are you putting the organization first, or are you putting yourself first? No conflicts of interest. A great example I mentioned to you earlier, I mentioned to you yesterday that I was seeking election to an office within my fraternal organization as treasurer. Well, my responsibility is to make sure I don't have any conflicts of interest. If I'm responsible, for example, for managing money, managing dollars, I need to make sure that I'm not hooking my friends up who may be money managers so that they get fees, who they really don't care about what's going on with the organization. You can't have that. So you have to have a clear line of delineation. You got to make sure that you don't cross over that line, because once you cross over that line, you enter into dangerous territory. No private gain. Now, let me say this. Nonprofit culture says that members of a board of directors can offer their services to the board of directors. So say you're an attorney and you're also a member of a local nonprofit board, and they say, well, we need some legal work. You can do that legal work and you can get paid for it. The challenge you have to make sure that you always follow is that your billing practices are in line with industry standards. So, for example, if it's typical that you would charge $250 to draft up some legal paperwork, and that's the standard, then don't charge $500. You've got to make sure that whatever you do is in line with industry standards. So it's not saying that you can't make monies through the work that you do, but the work that you do has to be fairly priced, and you have to give as great an effort as you would for any other client. Does that make any sense to anybody?
Yes, sir.
Outstanding. Now, so we talked about duty of care. We talked about a duty of loyalty. Now, a duty of obedience complies with the law and organizational decisions. Don't break the law. Don't do anything stupid. You probably wouldn't be surprised. You all are in law school. Y'all know what's up. You have seen some of your colleagues when it comes to tests and notes and things like that, skirt the law, walk right up to that line. Well, your job is to stay away from that line. And the best way for me to describe it is just don't even get started. Don't even start down that path, because once you start down that path of having conflicts of interest, of having not putting the organization first, then you get yourself in trouble. So make sure you have the duty of obedience, which means you comply with the law. As members of a board of directors, your job is to uphold, one, the law itself, but also uphold the bylaws and constitution of your organization. And so you're responsible for making sure that those bylaws are upheld. If we can't trust you as a member of the board to make sure that you're doing your job and doing your job effectively, that you're not cheating the system, that you're not cheating the organization, that you're not skirting rules, you'll be all right. But you got to make sure that you have a duty of obedience. Comply with the law and with organizational decisions. So the question is this: what could happen if these three duties are not followed? What could happen to an organization if these three duties, as described up here, are not followed to the best of your ability? Anyone? Mr. President?
From an organizational perspective, regulatory enforcement, and of course member scrutiny. So we serve members, so members are going to demand to know what's going on. And then from a legal perspective, not following these three duties, you can be personally liable for any shortcomings in finances, regulatory decisions that are made. They can come after you personally and the organization.
Absolutely. And you all know what it means to file a lawsuit. Some of you may know what it means to be sued. You don't want to be on the receiving end of a subpoena. You don't want to be on the receiving end of a lawsuit. And so you got to make sure that you follow these three duties and do them to as great an extent possible and to your best ability. Now, let's talk about the attributes that contribute to board effectiveness. First one is this: skills and knowledge. What are the skills that are needed for the board to effectively execute its responsibilities? Process. What processes are necessary for the board to both understand and properly oversee the activities of the organization? Let's pause for a moment. One of the biggest challenges that nonprofit organizations, members, would say, and so you want to make sure that you have the skills and knowledge. Now, process. One of my favorite TV shows is a show called The Prophet. And one of the things he talks about often is people, product, and process. And so process means that you have a way in which you do business. There are systems that you follow. I'll give you another example. In addition to the $1 million grant that I brought in, I also have had the opportunity over the course of the last couple years to help manage the process by which local chapters receive funding. How does that process unfold? And so we basically created systems that did not exist because they needed to be created. Well, what does that mean? Okay, we got $1 million. I'm not just going to hand you a check and say, go, knock yourself out. There's a process, one, by which we need to make sure you're in compliance. And so what we did was we set money or coming for them. They got their hand out, but they're not ready for the process. Well, there's a process that you have to follow. And your job as members of the board is to make sure that that process is followed decent and in order. Now, attributes that contribute to board effectiveness: information. Is the information received by the board adequate to support effective oversight and decision making? Very few things are as powerful as information. You need the information you need as a member of the board to do your job effectively. That means we need people to be honest. Honesty is not just a punchline to a dirty joke. It has to mean something. These words like honesty and character, integrity, they mean something. Well, part of being honest is making sure that everybody has the information. Now, let me just say this. Sometimes the information may not be good. Sometimes the news you get may not be what you want to hear. But you have a fiduciary responsibility to make sure that that information is delivered in a timely fashion. I'll never forget, I had the opportunity in a job a few moons ago. I was working with a supervisor, and we were working on a project, and I gave them my earnest opinion based on the information that I had. And they said, well, I don't want you to tell me that. I want you to tell me what I want to hear. I said, I'm sorry, I can't do that. I can't do it. Now, if that means I need to go right now, I ain't got no problem with that. Let the doorknob hit me where a dog should have bit me. But I've got to tell you the truth. Your job is to be truthful always. And the truth, it's interesting how the truth sounds like the truth. It's kind of like what your mama said. The truth sounds like the truth. And so you got to make sure that you're telling the truth all the time. Be honest with people. Give them the information they need. Give them the resources and access to the resources they need to make decisions for themselves and to make the best decisions for the organization. Now, behavior. Does the board's behavior support and reinforce strong oversight? As leaders of a nonprofit organization, as leaders of a membership-driven organization, as leaders of any kind of board of directors, you have a responsibility to make sure that you're acting right. You got a responsibility to make sure that your behavior is consistent with doing the right thing. How can you expect your members to do the right thing and you ain't doing it yourself? As a kid, we used to sing a song in church many years ago: sweep around your own front door before you try to sweep around mine. Is your front door clean? Have you looked into your own stuff? Have you made sure that every dot, every tittle of everything you say matches up with what's going on with your board and enforces strong oversight? One of the things I am supremely proud of, I've been a member of the organization I talked about for 23 years. And I'm proud of the fact that my name can't be found on anybody's gimme list. Well, what does that mean? That means that I can't expect to be a leader of an organization. I got my hand out, but I expect you to pay the bill. Ain't right, can't do it. And so what I would surmise and what I would submit to you is that you've got to make sure that your behavior is consistent with good leadership skills, with good principles. You've got to make sure that you're doing the right thing. Are you enforcing strong oversight? If you're doing the wrong thing, how can you expect the people who are supposed to be following you to do the right thing? It's kind of like saying to somebody, I need you to go bale that hay. And we've been out drinking all night last night. It's like, what you mean you want me to go bale that hay? We was getting drunk together last night. No. And so you've got to have clear lines of distinction. I spent a little time in the military, and one of the things that they enforce in the military is a separation between enlisted and non-commissioned, or rather enlisted officers and those who were commissioned officers. There's a line of distinction, and you disasters in the history of America. Let's talk about what happened. The directors of Enron, they failed their fiduciary responsibilities. What do you mean by that? The Enron board of directors failed to safeguard Enron shareholders by allowing Enron to engage in high-risk accounting, or as George W. Bush would say, fuzzy math. No fuzzy math. What else did they do? Inappropriate conflict of interest transactions. If you're handling the money, your boys can't be making the fees. And in fact, I would be skeptical of anybody who's got a whole slew of people who are waiting in the wings to make some money. This ain't about you. This ain't your money. This isn't your organization. It's our organization. This isn't your group and your means of assuming power. It belongs to the people. So you got to make sure you watch that at all times. Extensive, undisclosed, off-the-books activities, and excessive executive compensation. That's going to be important. Are the people who you're paying in the nonprofit, are they being compensated adequately? That's a good question. What else did Enron do? The board witnessed numerous indications of questionable practices by Enron management over several years, but chose not to say a damn thing. Well, you can't do the right thing, or rather you can't do the wrong thing and expect right results. If you see something wrong that's going on, you got to say something. It kind of reminds me, there was a great theologian by the name of Frederick Niemöller, and he talked about, he said, you know, when the Nazis came for the Jews, I did not say anything, well, because I wasn't a Jew. And then when the Nazis came for the gypsies, I didn't say anything because I wasn't a gypsy. And when they came for the gays, I didn't say anything because I wasn't gay. And then when they came for the blacks who were in Germany at the time, I didn't say anything because I wasn't black. And then they came for me. And there was nobody to speak out for me. And so the question becomes, when you see wrongdoing, do you say something about it? You best believe that you should. That's your responsibility. A lack of independence. The independence of the Enron board of directors was compromised by financial ties. You notice a recurring theme here? Money, money, money. You got to make sure you handle the money properly. The board also failed to ensure you've taken contract law. If you haven't, you will. You got to make sure that you sign proper contracts. And let me just say this. A verbal contract isn't worth the paper it's printed on. It needs to be in writing, and it needs to say the word contract, agreement, all no, contract. And you got to make sure that you have it in writing. And you got to make sure that it's fair. You got to make sure that you aren't being charged excessively. You got to make sure that you don't have your hand in the cookie jar. Well, let me make this side deal over here with the hotel so I can get paid on this side. No. When you start down that path, you get in trouble. So the best thing to do is to make sure you stay on the right path. The greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world that he did not exist. And so don't get led down the wrong path by the devil, who is convincing you that it's okay, you touch a little bit here, taste a little bit over there, it's okay, dip here, dab there. No. You got to make sure that you are above reproach. Protection of charitable assets, stealing and embezzlement. Do we have any fact checkers in the house?
Yep.
You got to make sure you have fact checkers in the house. And everything you say is above reproach, and you're not misrepresenting yourself. When you don't tell folks the whole truth, you're misrepresenting yourself. When you aren't fully above board, you're misrepresenting yourself. When you're leaving out large parts of the story, when you try to create a narrative to get folks to believe one thing, when there's a large part of the story that's relevant to what you just said, and you're not talking about that, you're misrepresenting yourself. Ineffective organizations, ones that do not accomplish their social mission. Again, who am I? Why am I here? What's the mission of the organization? Inefficient organizations, ones that get too little mileage out of the money they spend. You ought to be able to measure every dollar you spend. And you ought to be able to make sure that you're getting mileage out of the resources that you have. And finally, private enormment. Individuals who control the organizations attain excessive benefits for themselves. Freebies, handouts. Pay your way. Pay your fare. As the lady in the subway would say, pay your fare. You got to pay your own way. You know, if the members of your organization have to pay their way, if they got to register, if they got to pay for their room, you ought to register and pay for your room too. Unless members are appointed based on their individual status and skills. I mentioned to you earlier, I will say this again, just because you are the secretary of the organization, that doesn't mean that all you're going to be doing is taking minutes. Just because you are the chairman of the board, that doesn't mean that all you're going to be doing is wielding a gavel. Just because you're the treasurer of an organization, that doesn't mean that all you're going to be doing is counting coins and depositing dollars. As members of skills, I talked yesterday about if you want to be a good generalist, first you got to be a good general. Spend any time in the military, then you got to remember that you got to have a wide variety and a wide set of skills. That is critically important. Now, quality of board orientation and development. Little is done to get them to operate as a collective. For example, how do their individual skills complement one another to fulfill the governance role? Everybody has the capacity to be a leader. Everybody brings something to the table. There's a wonderful book. If you ever get an opportunity to read it, I would highly encourage you to do so. It's called From Good to Great. And one of the things it talks about in Good to Great is, one, first making sure you got the right people on the bus. Do we have the right people on the board? Then you got to make sure that you got once they get on the bus, are they in the right seats? Just because you're on the bus doesn't necessarily mean you need to be driving. And so are you the right person for the job, and are you in the right seat? And so that's important. That's why we got to make sure that the board has a quality orientation. You got to onboard your people in the right way. You can't just say, you know, raise your right hand, repeat after me. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that you're going to be a good member of this board? Yes, you do. Sit down. Okay, here you go. I need your vote. It has to be bigger than that. It has to be better than that. You got to make sure that you provide training and orientation for your board. Board capacity. A great team of high caliber managers, management experts with no or limited governance experience. And so you got to make sure that the people in the room have the capacity to do the job. Just because you got more degrees than a thermometer does not necessarily mean you're the right person for the job. Just because you've got several letters behind your name does not necessarily mean you have the capacity to do the job. I want you to remember, I need you to understand, I want you to never forget that when you are a member of the board, you're responsible for making sure that everything that comes before you as a member of the board, you have a vote on that. It's not just about your job on the board. It's about representing all of the constituents to the best of your ability. Amen. Does that make any sense to anybody?
Yeah.
Anybody live on my street? Mm-hmm. Outstanding. And board diversity. Cohorts in the board. You got to make sure that you have a diverse board. You don't want cookie cutter people. You want people that have the capacity to walk and chew gum at the same time. You don't want people who are one-trick ponies. And really, as members of a board, you really have to ask yourself a number and a series of fundamental questions. And the first question you have to ask yourself is, what do we want? As a board, what do we want? Do we want somebody who is going to tell us what they're going to do as a member of the board? Or do we want somebody that can show us what they've done in the past? Do we want somebody who checks a box? Yes, do they have letters behind their name? Check. Do they have this? Check. Or you want somebody that can box some checks. That's really important. Because as members of the board, you're responsible for bringing resources to the organization. Can you box some checks? Can you bring us some dollars? Can you bring some resources to the table? I had the opportunity when I was chief of staff at the National Urban League. I was responsible for basically fulfilling the mission of board recruitment and training for members of the board of directors for the National Urban League. Why is that significant? Well, it's significant because the members of the board were really the leaders and titans of politics and industry all across the country. The president of American Express, the president of Enterprise Rent-A-Car, a couple of cabinet secretaries, Secretary Alexis Herman, former labor secretary, Secretary Rodney Slater, former transportation secretary. I mean, these are major people. And my job was to make sure that they understood their role as a member of the board, make sure that they could bring something to the table. And let me just say this. If you're a member of a board of directors, and the only thing you're bringing to the table is your appetite, something is wrong somewhere. You ought to bring a steak, some chips, soda, bring something to the table. You know, when you don't show up to a party, you know, with aluminum foil and paper plates. You just don't do. Well, some people do that. You don't want to do that. Bring something to the table. What are you bringing to the table? And that means you got to have a diverse board who brings something to the table more than just their appetites. Now, let's talk about quality of board meetings for a moment. The only structure legally provided for a board to deliberate and make decisions on behalf of an organization is through your meetings. I've been leader of many organizations. I had the privilege of being president of my class from 4th grade through my sophomore year of college at Hampton University. I was president of my fraternity. So I've had the opportunity to sit in a number of leadership positions, and I always had a hard and fast rule. I didn't want to have a meeting that lasted longer than an hour. And I'm just a firm believer that even the Lord gets tired after an hour and a half. You know, it don't take all day to do nothing. I grew up in a little small sanctified church. And we would go to church at like 9 o'clock in the morning and got out at like 4:30 in the afternoon. Even God gets tired after an hour and a half. You know, it don't take all day to do nothing. And so you got to make sure that you have relevant meetings. Meetings are also the cornerstone of how the board carries out its governance role. And meetings must be effective and focused. Now, if an organization persists in a pattern of unproductive, listless, unclear, and pointless meetings, it will soon begin to lose commitment from its board members. You don't need to meet every week, and you don't need to meet all day. No. But when you meet, have a purpose, have a plan, have an agenda, hit it and quit it, and do something else. And so that's important for you to remember that. It doesn't take all day to do nothing. Some of y'all, I didn't mean that. I ain't mean that. The way it could. Oh, Lord. I digress. Now, let's talk about effective governance. Systems and structures can provide an environment conducive to good governance practices. But at the end of the day, it is the acts or omissions of the people charged with relevant responsibilities that will determine whether governance objectives are in fact achieved. Let's look at that again. It's the acts or omissions of people charged with relevant responsibilities will determine whether or not governance objectives are achieved. So what does that mean, Brother Dowling? That's very simple. Are you leaving something out? What are you not covering? What are you not talking about? Are you making sure that what you're doing is relevant to our mission? And when it comes to board governance and drilling down to the mission, let's give this example. The identification of the background, skills, and expertise of the people who walk into the boardroom is a good start. But it is what they do when they get there that is critical. You can have more degrees than a thermometer. That doesn't mean you're the right person for the job. Talked about that little sanctified church I grew up in. My pastor used to say something all the time. He used to say, it doesn't matter how much you can shout and dance. How straight can you walk when your feet hit the floor? And so that's the question we have for you today. How straight can you walk when your feet hit the floor? You can have a law degree. That's great. You can be a certified chief financial planner, that's wonderful. But how straight can you walk when your feet hit the floor? What else are you bringing to the table other than just your appetite? What else are you bringing to the table other than just your credentials? Are you bringing something that's going to be of benefit to the organization in the long run? That's the real question that we have. And so we always want to make sure that we have effective governance policies. Now, let's talk about the quality of the board chair, the person in charge. The board chair has the ability to lead the board, the ability to listen to all voices, including dissenting voices, the ability to manage the meeting and agenda process and content, has to be candid enough to address sensitive issues, yet respectful of the CEO, who should be a critical friend, and ensures individual board members' accountability for personal and collective performance. The chairman of the board, the president of the organization, your national leader has a very important responsibility. But with that being said, they were not elected to be a dictator. Let's be clear about that. And I want to charge everybody in here, I want to charge everybody listening underneath the sound of my voice, if you are a member of an organization that has a national leader, you ought to push them into greatness. What do you mean by that, Brother Dowling? I'm reminded of A. Philip Randolph, Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. A. Philip Randolph came
Mighty
to...
Sigma Man.
Mighty Sigma Man. You always tell a Sigma Man, just can't tell him much. So A. Philip Randolph, a mighty Sigma Man, a great Sigma Man, he came to the President of the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and he said, you know, Mr. President, African Americans are being treated poorly. The people who are working on the rail cars are being treated poorly. We've got to do something about this. We need you to do X, Y, and Z. You know what the President of the United States said? Make me do it. Martin Luther King Jr. went to Lyndon Baines Johnson and said, Mr. President, we need a Civil Rights Act. We need a Voting Rights Act. We need protection on the streets. Our people are being hung. They're being lynched. They're being mistreated. We need your help. You know what LBJ said to Martin Luther King? Make me do it. And that's what you have to do. You have to force people sometimes into greatness. And the challenge with unchecked authority, the challenge with unchecked leadership, oftentimes they feel like they can do anything. I am the head individual in charge. But no, this organization doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the people. You know, this country does not belong to Donald Trump. It belongs to America. It belongs to the Americans. It belongs to the people. And so we got to make sure that we hold our leaders accountable. We have to make sure that leaders include all dissenting voices. One of the worst things a leader can do is set himself up with a group of yes people around him. Mm-hmm. Bad move. Remember I told you how I told my old boss, I'm not here to tell you what you want to hear. I'm here to tell you the truth. Now, the truth can be ugly. The truth can be pretty. But we're going to know the truth. We're going to know it today. And the truth is going to set us free. And I'm crazy enough to believe that whom the truth sets free is free indeed. Mm-hmm. And so you got to be candid enough to address sensitive issues and yet respective of the organization at the time and respective of the leader of the organization. So most membership-driven organizations, most nonprofit organizations have a CEO who runs the day-to-day operations, and they have a board chair. And the board chair and the CEO or executive director or COO, whatever you want to call them, they have to work together. Oftentimes, the board chair thinks that he is the boss and that he is running things. That's not what we elected you to do. There's a reason why we hired an executive director. Let that individual do their job. Let that woman do her job. Let that man do his job. Your job as a member of the board is to set the vision, to write the vision, make it plain, and give the staff, give the people who are running the day-to-day operation, give them the resources, the training they need to do their jobs effectively. Does that make any sense to anybody?
Mm-hmm. Yes, sir.
Outstanding. Don't call me sir. I work for a living. Now, we needed a strong chair to deal with the elephant in the room. How many of you know that most leaders don't like dealing with the elephant in the room? That's a bad, bad thing. Let's talk about it. And so, as leaders of a board of directors, Your job is to ask the right questions. Remember I said earlier that the best way to get the right answer is to ask the right question? And so your job is to deal with the elephant in the room. Now, we're going to talk about this today. We're going to shut the doors, and we're going to handle this right now. And so that's the job of the board of directors, to deal with the elephant in the room. Make sure you have strong chairs, because we're going to deal with this. And so that's your job as members of the board of directors. And let me just say, it can be uncomfortable being on a board. If you do the right thing, if you ask those probing questions, if you stand up for what's right, if you make sure you're representing the best interests of the people that elected you, it can be uncomfortable sometimes. The leader of the organization may not like you sometimes, but you know what? You ain't my boss. We were elected, you're elected by the individuals who sent you here to lead, and you have a responsibility to them to make sure that you're doing the right thing at all times, because it's the right thing to do. Now, let's talk about board effectiveness. Now, the first thing in terms of board effectiveness, the effectiveness of a board strongly correlates to the quality of its conversations. What does that mean? The quality of its conversations. The effectiveness of a board strongly correlates to the quality of its conversations. Now you all are future Supreme Court justices, so I want to call on one of my justices to tell me what they think I mean when I talk about the effectiveness of the board is strongly correlated to the quality of its conversations. Which one of the 9 justices would like to hear the first oral argument? Anyone? 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 The beautiful young lady with that slamming fuchsia top. Tell me what you think that means when we say that the board is as effective as the conversations that they hold.
So if they're not having productive conversations or topics or visions that they're trying to seek, and it's not, for lack of better words, that hour that they're having, if they're just doing things that aren't on point with what they're trying to focus on, then the board itself and the corporation won't be good.
Absolutely. The board won't grow, the organization won't prosper if you're not having those tough conversations. Quality of conversation is dependent on leadership. Leadership is doing the right thing even when no one else is watching. Leadership is unpopular. Leadership is tough. Leadership is demanding, but leaders we must be. Lead we must. Quality management of the agenda. If you're going to have a meeting, have an agenda. Let's go through the agenda. Let's do what we need to do, and let's do something else. Quality of information, management and committee reports. If you're a committee member, your report needs to be on time, sister. Your report needs to be on time, brother. You got to make sure you're giving us all the information. Don't leave the important parts out. Give us the good, give us the bad, but most importantly, give us the ugly, because that's what we need to know in order to be effective. We need to make sure that the board's understanding of strategy and preparations, planning, and involvement, all of these are important to making sure that your board is efficient and effective. Now, appropriateness and timeliness. Quality of members, passion, trust, integrity, and commitment. I want to focus on these 2 things right here. Integrity and commitment. Integrity and commitment. Integrity is not, as I said earlier, a punchline to a dirty joke. Integrity is real, and it ought to mean something. Character is real. It ought to mean something. When you say you're honest, you ought to be honest. Keep going back to this small country church. My pastor used to say all the time, tell the truth, shame the devil. Let the chips fall where they may. But integrity begins with you. It begins with being honest. And it begins with commitment. Why are you here? Who am I? Why am I here? It begins with commitment. And commitment means sometimes you stay up late. Sometimes you don't get any sleep. Sometimes you miss meals. Smart leaders eat last. They don't eat first, they eat last. One of the things I learned in Army ROTC at Hampton University was this whole concept of making sure that my people were taken care of first. Got to take care of your people first. You always tell a Hampton woman, you just can't tell her much. So you got to make sure that your people are taken care of first. Smart leaders eat last. And that means you have to be committed. You got to be committed enough to be selfless and to sacrifice yourself for the good of the whole. Remember we talked about that concept of summum bonum, for the good of the whole, those words that were written above the doorpost. What are you doing for the good of the whole? And you getting in line first, that ain't for the good of the whole. That's for the good of you. And we've had enough of that in leadership. We have had enough of selfish leaders. Aren't y'all ready to do something else? Don't we deserve better? Don't we deserve organizations that are led by people who are not in it for themselves, who are not in it to make a fee, who are not in it to do anything other than what's for the good of the whole, summum bonum. So we got to be cognizant of that when we talk about board effectiveness. Now, let's talk about quality and timeliness of board reports. Now, what does the board need to know? Not what you think the board should know. Tell the truth. Quality and timeliness of board reports. First of all, we need your report, brother, and we need it on time. Don't be late with your reports. If the chairman of the organization says we need your report by the 15th, that's not the 17th. That's not the 16th. That's by the 15th, preferably the 12th if you can. Be timely. To be early is to be on time. To be on time is to be late. And to be late is unacceptable. And so you got to always be early if you can. Simple and focus on the real question and issue. Generates and mines the board value. And bridging management action and board requirements. What are the action items? We want to get X, Y, and Z accomplished. Okay, that's great. What is the board's role in making sure that these action items are accomplished? Everybody has a role to play. Everybody's got a role to play. And that role is oftentimes bigger than just one aspect. You ought to be looking to have people on your board who are more than just one-trick ponies. Can you bring something to the table other than just your appetite? Can you do something other than count? Can you do something other than read? Can you do something other than laugh and tell jokes? What can you bring to the table that's going to help to move the organization forward in an efficient and effective manner? And so quality and timeliness of board reports is critical. Now let's talk for a moment about board decisions. Well-informed and high-quality decision-making is a critical requirement for a board to be effective and does not happen by accident. Well-informed and high-quality decision-making is critical. It's a critical requirement of a board to be effective and does not happen by happenstance. There's no such thing as a coincidence. Your board will not just coincidentally know what it's doing. There's no such thing as a coincidence. You got to make sure that decision-making is well-informed. Do we have all the information we need to make the right decision? Do we have high-quality information? Or is the information we're getting bogus? Do we have what we need to make the right decision? Flawed decisions can be made with the best of intentions, with competent individuals believing passionately that they are making a sound judgment when they are not. I want you to remember and never forget, the path to hell is paved with good intentions. Everybody's got good intentions. Well, we need better than just good intentions. Has anyone ever thought something was a good idea? You thought this was a brilliant idea. I will give you an example. And then you realize that maybe it's not, and you paused for a moment, and you asked someone else's opinion, and they said, I don't know if that's the right thing to do. I'll give you a great example. I had the opportunity to address some choice words that was said about me and my capacity to be the best me that I could be. And it was actually this week. It was in a social media setting. And I was going to respond with some choice words myself. And I had crafted this email and was ready to hit send. And I said, you know what? Let me send this to my homeboy and let him take a look at it. He read it and called me up and said, man, you must be crazy. Don't send that. And I said, okay, I see what you mean. I get your perspective. I'll never forget a good friend of mine by the name of Dr. James Wesley Ward out of the great Texas Southern University in Houston. I'll never forget to him, TSU. I said to, Dr. Ward said to me once, he said, Elvin, be careful what you put in writing because it just might come back to haunt you. And he told me this maybe 20 years ago. I never forgot it. Be careful what you put in writing because it just might come back to haunt you. As attorneys, you all understand the power of the written word. You all, my greatest mentor was an attorney by the name of Dr. William Malcolm Batts III. And Brother Dr. Batts, he was an attorney extraordinaire. He had also spent some time at Prairie View A&M as the Dean of Students.
I'm sorry.
Now,
okay, first of all, undergrad was PB, my law school is Texas Southern.
there you go.
See,
There you go. Get them straight.
it's okay.
Right.
So, Dr. Batts used to say, whenever somebody would bother me, he would say, do you want me to write them boys a little nastygram? And a nastygram was his way of putting something in writing. So you got to be very careful what you put in writing because it just might come to haunt you. Now, many of the factors which lead to poor decision making are preventable and predictable. Pause for a moment before you make that decision, before you send that email, before you respond in kind. Pause for a moment. Ask, is this productive to the organization? Is this helpful to us? Is this going to help us to move the organization forward? Or maybe I should just shut up and not say anything. Ask yourself that fundamental question. Now, check this out. He's right. When you look at it that way, it's not so bad. Skewed information. Now, you see the sales chart, it was initially pointing down and somebody had the bright idea. Well, let's just turn it on its side and everything's all right. No, that's not how leadership works. You got to make sure that you're giving the members of your organization the information they need to do what they need to do effectively. Ambition versus capacity. A danger often faced by boards is trying to do too much with too little information and doing too little with too much information. So you got to make sure that what you have the ambition of doing, you have the capacity to do it as well. Now, let's talk about for a moment board members' behavior. We don't need yes people. We need more dissenting opinions. And then you see everybody say, we agree 100%. As a member of a board, your job is not to be a yes woman or a yes man. Your job is to ask the right questions to get to the right answers. And so you got to make sure that your behavior is on point as well. Now, as an effective board should not do a number of different things. Should not be necessarily a comfortable place. We talked about the fact that being on a board can oftentimes be uncomfortable. When you're making decisions and you're doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do, I guarantee you, you're going to piss somebody off. Shouldn't matter. Your job is to do the right thing because it's the right thing to do. Your job is to make sure that your behavior is consistent with the mission of the board. As a board, what you say or don't has an impact on the final decision and ultimately the quality and direction given for the mission. So you want to make sure that your behavior is consistent. Now let's talk about governance and management interface. The relationship between the CEO and the board is often one that is viewed as very complex. Now many CEOs have difficulty developing and nurturing a healthy relationship with their boards. So your organization needs to make sure that you have a healthy relationship between leadership and the board. And that's your job to make sure that you don't have any unethical entanglements with your staff, that you don't have, you're making sure you're saying the right thing to the staff, you're doing the right thing with the staff. Don't get involved with the staff on a personal level. Don't get involved with the staff on a personal level. Just don't do it. Oh, Lord. This morning.
Yeah.
Effective governance. Governance performance versus organization performance. There's a strong consensus that you cannot separate the two. Inefficiency grows out of inadequate board governance. Inadequate board governance also creates the conditions that make embezzlement, misappropriation of funds, and self-dealing possible. Also, the case for the domineering executive director and CEO and the weak board seems to be quite atypical across the spectrum. So you need to make sure you have a strong CEO, but you also need to make sure you have a strong board. And finally, the issue is therefore not whether good governance is a linchpin to organizational success, but how to get board members to govern to ensure institutional performance. So as I close, I want to leave you all with the Great Wall of China example, and I want to use it as a cautionary tale. So we see, in ancient China, the people deserved security from the barbaric people in the north. So they built the Great Wall of China. It was so tall that they knew no one would climb, and so thick that no one could break it down. So they settled back to enjoy their security. However, during the first 100 years of the wall's existence, China was invaded not one, not two, but 3 times. Not once did anyone manage to break down the wall or climb over. History tells us that each time they bribed a gatekeeper to open up the gates. The Chinese were so busy relying upon the great walls of stone that they neglected to find gatekeepers who were men of integrity. As members and leaders of a board, you have to be individuals of integrity. It doesn't matter what type of infrastructure you have built to support your board. It doesn't matter what types of policies and procedures you have for the organization and the board to follow. If you stealing, use the lie and the mink, your belly poke out and your feet stink. Something is wrong somewhere. You got to get it together. You got to make sure that you're doing the right thing. You got to make sure that you have people in place who are telling you the truth, who don't have their hands out, and who aren't taking bribes to let people in the back door. And so it's a cautionary tale of leadership. Nonprofit governance is not a joke. Having the right people in the right places, getting the right people on the bus, and then putting them in the right seats is critically important to nonprofit corporate governance. Thank you all very much. I hope this has been helpful to you.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you again on behalf of the boss. We just want to give you a small token of our appreciation. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you all very much. This has been a wonderful experience. Looks like we have one question. Okay.
I just want to know